just to kick us off, the title for this session is how to apply the 4 returns framework to either farms or estates. So it's not something that we do, and when I say we, I mean Commonland Foundation. I'll introduce it a little bit afterwards, because we work at landscape scales. However, the principles we believe can be applied, and as I'm also a landholder managing 28 acres in Southeast Ireland, I do apply that on our own farm. So there's an option to go into stories of that. There's also the work within landscapes where we work with estates. But I'd also love to hear from you what drew you to this session. And yeah, so I'll introduce Commonland a little bit in the 4 returns, and then we'll open up and just hear a little bit like why you joined today's session. So Commonland Foundation was started about 11 years ago by our founder, Willem Verweda, a Dutchman who had worked with IUCN for many years, really passionate about conserving and restoring nature. And one of the things he realized during that work, that often protecting or restoring nature meant that the land use would have to change. So people would be using that land for agriculture or for any other land use, and that was actually causing the damage, and removing people would be the solution. But if you want to restore landscapes at scale, removing people from nature is not going to be something that works. Like we depend on land use for so much of our economy and our livelihoods. And he had this deep desire to figure out, can we restore nature with people as part of the equation? So he took a year sabbatical and traveled around the world and spoke to farmers and economists and lots of different types of stakeholders on this question: how can we restore nature at a large scale with people still as part of the equation? And after that year, he came up with the 4 returns framework. And so the 4 returns framework is based on this notion that land use decisions are made by humans very often, or more often than not, based on one return: maximization of profit per acre or per hectare, financial profit. So how can we make as much money as possible from this piece of land or this piece of ocean? And if we do that, then basically we are depleting the resources of that piece of land or water and turning it into economic value only. And so there will be losses in that system. There will be a loss of biodiversity, of soil quality, water quality, but there may also be a loss of social capital. If we're just extracting the value and turning it into financial value, we might be exporting that and not actually, that profit may not flow back into the community. So there may be a loss of livelihoods, a loss of jobs, and eventually a loss of hope or purpose for the people living in that landscape. So he realized that if that economic driver is causing all of this degradation, then maybe we need to move towards an economy that has different returns built in. So a return of financial profit is only 1 out of 4, and the other returns would be a return of natural capital. So if we design our systems and make our decisions in such a way that we always take care of biodiversity, of carbon, of water, of soil, and we also do that socially. So we think of livelihoods, we think of communities, we think of jobs, we think of relationships, and those 3 then, so natural capital, social capital, and financial capital, would be, you could say, are the triple bottom line, the people, planet, profit. But he also realized that that's not enough, because what's really driving that change, or why would people do that? Why would people make different decisions or use different values? Well, they'd have to be passionate about it. So they would have to feel passion for nature, for people, for sort of a holistic approach, and there would need to be a return of inspiration. If you're not inspired or full of purpose or full of drive and hope, or have dreams, well, then it's very hard to start to do things differently. So I realized, mostly through conversations, that the return of inspiration is actually the key sort of driver that gets that change happening. And people need to have a lot of courage to make changes to their business or to their farm or to their estate. And that courage comes from a return of inspiration. And I think it's the same thing that has fueled the groundswell movement, and also this event. This event is not done for financial profit. It's done out of a inspiration. So he set out to test this and build Commonland as an organization to support landscapes around the world and test this 4 returns framework. And that initially happened with a landscape in South Africa, in the Baviaanskloof, which is a river shed or watershed close to Port Elizabeth, and southeast Spain, rapidly desertifying Mediterranean climate with high levels of soil erosion and decline of livelihoods, young people moving away. So you could say desertification of the land, but also a type of desertification of the communities, empty villages, abandoned houses, etc. There was a second landscape where this was tested. We also tested in the Netherlands, you could say a green desert with high production monoculture and high production dairy systems, loss of biodiversity, but also very hidden degradation. There's lots of degradation happening in the Netherlands, but it's not so necessarily so easy to see as southern Spain is. And then Western Australia was the fourth landscape, and a couple of years later, Northeast India. So in these landscapes, we work at a scale of about at least 50,000 hectares over longer periods of time. So landscape restoration takes at least one generation or at least 20 years if we want this to be done holistically. So if we want to take care of the communities within that landscape, if we want to take care of the economy within that landscape and restore the natural capital, we have to take long timelines. So at least 20 years is the kind of timeline in which we should be working. So we said, okay, I've only been with Commonland for 4.5 years, but the founders said, let's take 10 years to test this at landscape scale. Can we build a partnership? Is there uptake? And let's make lots of mistakes and learn how to do this. And what we realized is that there's a couple of things that worked well. One of the things that worked well is to build farmers networks and have farmer-to-farmer exchanges where pilot farmers could be part of a group and didn't feel that they were taking the risk on their own. But then also establishing partnerships beyond just farmers, working with local supply chains, but also with local municipality, policymakers, consumers on various groups, and build those relationships over time. So building the relationships has been something that came up in all of those landscapes as being very crucial. Having events where people come together to discuss and explore, that has remained very much a part of the work. And then identifying business cases that could work. So what are the 4 returns business cases that could bring those different returns and could also be implemented. So whether that is regenerative almond production in southern Spain or essential oil production in South Africa, or regenerative oats in Western Australia, the business cases look very different in different regions, and some of them worked, some of them epically failed. So there's lots of learning around that as well, and then the challenges of then bringing those products to market. So there's lots of learning that we did over those years, and in 2019 we said, okay, right, we feel that we're starting to learn enough about how to bring this to other landscapes around the world, and we're now rapidly scaling the amount of partnerships that we support. There's 20 landscapes involved at the moment, but I think there'll soon be many more. And maybe I'll just finish off this introduction now with bringing it a bit closer to home. So myself, I'm Dutch, but I'm based in Southeast Ireland within one of the landscapes that the Commonland supporting. I do a lot of work there together with Sarah, who's our weaver, as we call it in the southeast of Ireland, building those relationships, making those connections, identifying the business cases, and so on. So that's the landscape scale. But today's session was very much about the farm scale and the scale of an estate. And we do get asked often, can this be done at a farm scale? And there's a few stories that I share to kind of kick us off, and then I'll open up the floor to you. But one of the things that we notice is that almost all of our landscapes have one or several example farms that really embody these principles, and that's really key. So, for example, in the landscape in southeast Spain, which is called Alvalal territory, which is 3, I guess, counties, you could say, 3 smaller regions together. One of the key sort of catalyzing places is a regenerative farm, where they apply the 4 returns on the farm, and they embody all of that, and they catalyze all of the other farmers. So that sort of pioneering spirit, whether it's one farm or a few farms, is really key. So That's one story of something that we've learned plays a big role. What we also notice, especially in the work in Southeast Ireland, is that there are many estates, which is, I think, quite a unique feature of landscapes in this part of the world. Estates are, in many countries of the world, a non-existing concept. So, but for this part of the world, estates are a very big part. And in Southeast Ireland, for example, has the highest density of estates within the Republic of Ireland. Many of them actually still owned by English royalty or English aristocracy, or by, let's say, foreigners, at least from the eye of the Irish, to be considered foreigners. And they're the largest landowners, and often will have fishing rights or will have commonage ownership, and are a very big player, but are not actually necessarily always rooted in the community, because they're not necessarily connected through family and so on in the community. So they are a very big player in the landscape, and how to involve them is a key question of our work. And some estates approach us, not necessarily within the bioregion in the southeast, but there is this question of like landowners or estate owners realizing, hey, I have a big role to play in the landscape. I have a large area of land that I'm managing, or that we are managing. What can we do in terms of restoration or protection of this land for the future? So it's a question that's coming toward us. And maybe as the last sort of story, so I live and work on a 28-acre farm within that landscape in Southeast Ireland, and try to bring those principles also to the farm. And that's tricky, but also fascinating. So how do we make a little bit of financial profit, but also how do we create space for nature on the farm? How do we make that a social hub and invite people in? And how can it be a source of inspiration for other farmers? And it's I really like that approach, to not only think about production on the farm, but to also, let's say, production for economic profitability, but also to think of the farm as a source of inspiration for myself and others, but also the farm as a place where people could come through, and the value it could bring for the community, and how the farm could also bring natural capital back. So how can we increase biodiversity on the farm? How can we take care of the water, the soil, and so on? So maybe that to kick us off. We've grown in the room. I don't know if there is a mic, but otherwise maybe just speak up. I'd love to hear just a couple of voices, like why did you come to this session and what are your questions, to see where we take the conversation from here. So maybe just, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit, like what drew you to this session, what are your questions?
I'm Lorna Cole, SAC Consulting, and really I'm interested, how do you benchmark where you're baseline, where you're starting from, and how do you monitor change across so many different aspects? How do you measure it? How do you know you're being successful from a social aspect, natural capital aspect?
Yeah, it's a great question. We do get this question a lot, and one of the things, or there's many things we learn in that regard. What Commonland has developed is a monitoring, evaluation, and learning tool or framework, ML framework, that we've been testing with landscapes that we've worked with over a number of years. That has a indicator menu that we've developed with them. And one of the most important things that we learned there is around usability. So of course we can build hundreds of indicators and make very specific measurement programs. We can test all different types of indicators just in the soil alone. And the more detailed we design it, the more work it is, and the less likely it is that we're going to be monitoring on all of those levels. So we've also learned to simplify, and this is mostly with farmers that need to build in these kinds of indicators into their practice. It's just not workable to do detailed soil analysis, detailed water analysis, but also analysis of social indicators, economic indicators, when they already have to provide that kind of data to government, etc. So we've simplified it to the level where we feel it's still giving enough richness in the data, but also makes it easy. And we've recently made that an open source tool that's available for all, called the Forward Turns Diagnostics tool. So Commonland has is very open with all of our learnings. We make them available on our platform, the Forward Turns platform. which can be found at commonland.com. And the forward turns diagnostics tool is a tool that anyone can use at any level, where you can use the pre-existing indicators and add your own, and do a first diagnosis of your farm, your estate, or your landscape, and then basically fill in the tool once a year or once every 6 months or however often you want to then track progress, and it automatically creates pie charts and all that. So that's something that we offer. We see that our landscapes use that one, but also sometimes slightly adapt it to their own context or try to integrate it with existing tools that they use. Yeah, have a look at that and see if that's helpful.
I have a question. Just what have you done in your farm to make it a source of inspiration for other farmers? And if you could tell us a bit about what you've seen other farmers who are applying this framework do to make it a source of inspiration.
Yeah, so what we see other farms in the network of Commonland do is to make their farm kind of like an open laboratory. So when they are taking risks or experimenting with new crops or new methods, to just be really open and honest about, hey, we're trying this, we're experimenting, and please come and have a look. So, for example, the Farmers Network in the Netherlands is mostly dairy farmers, and it started with a group of 5 farmers that was wanting to basically wean themselves off artificial fertilizer. And one of the things they started to pilot was bokashi compost. So they would ferment crop residue, and the pilot that they did on their farms, it was very open, very transparent, and any farmer within the region could come onto those farms, and they would actually be really honest. We don't know if this will work. This is what we're trying. This is the mixture we're using. So having a farm as an open, transparent laboratory and being allowed to fail is really key. Another really key thing is having a learning element as part of the farm. So for example, the farm in Spain, they have sort of an academy on the farm. It's called the Regeneration Academy. So students that are writing their thesis of any bachelor's or master's program around a topic of agroecology or regenerative agriculture, they can come and either write their thesis or do their research on a piece of like a challenge on the farm. So they come onto the farm for 3 months or 6 months. They can choose a challenge that the farm is dealing with. They can do their research, and they are part of a group of young people or students learning. And then there's additional courses they can take. So building learning into the farm is also a key thing. So on our farm, we have only just started 2 years ago, so we're in very early stages, but these are the kind of things that I aspire to as well. So maybe one example where actually a similar view to this view here, uplands, most of our neighbors are grazing common edge land. We're surrounded by Sitka spruce plantations, and we're a small farm with just a few fields and a bit of forestry as well. And one of the ideas that actually came out of the landscape process, like, well, what could be alternative income streams in uplands farming, where sheep farmers will describe that 2 generations ago they would make their family's year income from selling wool, and now they don't know how to get rid of it as a waste product. What are some alternatives? So, for example, I'm inspired to then test some of these alternatives at a small scale to see, do they even work, and can they inspire other farmers? So very concretely, we were inspired by a particular type of berry, chokeberry or aronia berry, which can be grown. It's originally from North America, but is grown successfully in Austria, Poland, and Denmark as a superfood or super berry that can be grown in this climate. We wouldn't have to import acai berry, and we could drink aronia juice, which has very high health benefits. So can this be grown on exposed sort of marginal lands with this kind of climate? We planted some last winter, and we'll harvest our first crop in the next couple of weeks. And so there is some profitability in that crop. We would have a return of financial investment within 2 seasons. It's only an acre and a half, so it's very small scale. But if we do manage to make it successful, there is growth potential in the Irish market at least. And it could inspire other farmers. And within planting that, within a couple of weeks, news spread, and my neighbor came and looked at it and said, "Oh, that's interesting. How much is your harvest going to be? How much do you get paid per kilo?" So I think it's that conversation that's really interesting. The aronia berries is my investment. I take that risk personally on a private level. And so Commonland does not get involved at the farm level because we believe that the impact at the landscape level is interesting because we can make serious impact on biodiversity if we work at the landscape level. And often, for example, if we want to restore a river, there's no point working just with one farm. We'll have to work with all of the farms along that river. And if we want to restore natural areas, we need all of the landowners either in or around that natural area. So Commonland only supports landscape partnerships, which may start as a few organizations or individuals working together at a small scale, but may grow to larger areas. So where, for example, in Spain, it started with 3 farmers. There's now 300 members of the association. In the Netherlands, it started with 5 farmers. There's now, I think, about 200 farmers that are part of the network. And then we support that partnership as such. So we support with a bit of funding to mostly get the process going of building that landscape partnership. And we support with learning and building learning networks across landscapes, helping develop business cases, but also what we call blended finance mechanisms. So often financing this kind of change is a mix of different finance mechanisms. So there might be some business cases with a financial return as well, but there may also be business cases that have a beautiful social outcome or natural capital outcome, but may not have a financial outcome. So how can we finance those? Sometimes it's a mix of public funding, philanthropy. We're exploring, can carbon or biodiversity credits play a role? It's very tricky, but we're trying to figure out how can that be part of the mix. So thinking along with that landscape partnership on how to do that, that's the role of Commonland. Yeah.
So I'm very interested in your farmer networks. So I just wonder if you could give us some examples of how they work.
Yeah, so one of the things we hear often in the UK is these cluster groups. So I think it's similar to that. How we start with that, for example, in Southeast Ireland, Sarah has been just following the leads of like, okay, there's this farmer doing things differently. Okay, it starts with there. You go to have the conversation at the kitchen table. They'll mention another farmer that they know that are doing things differently. And when you bring them together into a room, it can only be 5 farmers initially. They'll have some sort of shared interest and shared story, and they're keen to stay connected. So, for example, in the Netherlands, it was the bokashi fermentation trial that got that first group going. After doing a pilot, they then had another couple of farmers interested, and it naturally grew. And Weiland, which is the Dutch organization that's supporting the process, they barely promoted the farmers network. It was the farmers' word of mouth that grew the network because they all have similar challenges. And when some farmers take the leap to do something about the challenge in a way that's different, and the results are not totally negative, then other farmers are intrigued and kind of peeking and trying to figure things out. So, for example, in Spain, where the rain-fed almond production was already largely organic, but still struggling with very long periods of drought, very high temperatures in the summer, soil erosion, where farmers started to do cover crops and grazing with sheep and to try and build organic matter in the soil, there would be very clear differences of weeks of green cover, and farmers would see, hey, your farm is still looking green and mine is already totally yellow, totally dead. What are you doing? So it's that curiosity that makes farmers interested to join, and then once they're part of the network, they're very keen to stay involved and help each other. And in every landscape that we support, we see farmers networks just naturally grow.
And are they WhatsApp groups?
It's WhatsApp groups. Yeah, it's WhatsApp groups. There's meetups. There's trials. So some farmers are more proactive and do trials on their farms. For example, another thing in Spain that they realize is that some of the practices require new machinery. So rather than each farmer investing in their own new machine, they set up a machine bank, kind of like a machine library. So that was really successful, and they're now starting a second one. So it's those kinds of concrete outcomes that come out of the farmers network itself. And I could see that now also with the aronia berries in Ireland, it's early stages. There's no machine in Ireland yet that could harvest those berries, but we think in a number of years there might be enough growers to then collectively purchase a machine and share the machine and so on. So I think that's the power of it. It starts with a few, and then it grows, and then it self-organizes. So maybe a question. Yeah, sorry.
I do think finance still underpins so much of those sorts of decisions, as well as that inspiration and that sort of pressure. But so, from my past experience, I've been an organic grower and been involved in a lot of farm-to-farmer networks and done a lot of like on-farm tours and things like this. But it's a huge amount of pressure and responsibility, and it can be completely encompassing. So when I had a baby, I was just like, there's no way I can kind of balance this, that sort of world. And now I'm very much in a different world, which is kind of an estate-style world. But yeah, I wonder if there's an element, if you found that with sort of, especially if there's like these key farms that are kind of the driving, inspiring forces. Yeah, they're quite incredible people, but I also worry about that sort of kind of like personal sustainability that we don't talk about so much.
Yeah, totally. So this is where we notice that the return of inspiration is really acknowledged as a vital element of it. So it's in many of our landscapes that especially farmers will say the fact that you mention inspiration is already such a relief, because it's sometimes only inspiration that's driving someone to do something, right? And to acknowledge that if you're not inspired, so if there is burnout, that is also a factor. So it's not only the balance sheet and the financials that decide whether it's working or not. It's also how you feel about it. The fact that that's acknowledged as part of the equation, and you could also actually have a conversation about, is really key. And especially then the focus on bringing inspiration back onto the farm. So for example, in Spain, they've been doing these regeneration festivals with farmers, with communities, where families come out and everyone joins in, celebrating local food, and imagining the future together. And people will refer to those festivals as being really key. It's like, finally I'm being seen. Like farmers will say, I'm being seen as an important member of the community, I'm part of the future. Local musicians will come and they'll dance and they'll celebrate local food, and that's a really vital element of it. And it's not just about rules and regulations and money and so on. It's like, no, that actually also is important, and acknowledging that, I think, is really key.
So just on that, are those festivals organized by the state?
No, by the wider community, so farmers, their families, local musicians, local artists, young people that have moved back into the region.
So I wondered if you gathered any statistics around the changes and benefits that may have brought individual farmers.
So statistics, not yet. So we do have stories, and we have examples from the landscapes. Statistics, we haven't gathered data at the level of statistics. I know that it's a very big issue now in Ireland, and there's been national analysis done on mental health in farming communities, and it's really quite concerning in terms of male suicide rates, suicidal thoughts. I think it's 40% of farmers have suicidal thoughts in Ireland. So it is definitely one of the biggest challenges, and also acknowledged, at least in Ireland, by the government as one of the key things to focus on. And when we talk about a farming transition, sure, there's the actual farming system, farming, moving towards less intensive or less chemical or more organic or more nature friendly. Well, that's all lovely to say, but if you don't take into account the mental health of the farmer, that if he or she is already mentally challenged, would then have to go through a conversion process of any kind of farm transition, well, how does that even going to work? So I think acknowledging that is really key. And especially having that dialogue. So that's where the farmer groups or farmer networks, I think, are really key to have that conversation. And this is also confirmed. It was interesting, the family dynamics session just in the other tent over there just before, where it's not just the one farmer that's part of the dialogue, but the farming family and neighbors and the community to try and just get that dialogue going, I think, is really key. And then across our landscapes, we see that's really important. Have the space for the dialogue. And facilitating the dialogue and speaking about issues that are often unspoken, building safe spaces for those conversations is really key.
And that's happening as part of
it. It is happening, yeah. We call that, so in our work we call that creating spaces of belonging.
Right.
So it's bringing back that sense of belonging to your farm, to your family, to your landscape. That process of creating safe spaces for dialogue is really key. And we acknowledge it as being as important as building sound economic business cases. That's important too, but they will fail if there's no strong sense of trust, strong relationships, strong mental health, and so on. There's no point building those business cases if that isn't also in place.
So you mentioned that you've learned some lessons in terms of failures and successes. So what were some of these lessons, particularly I think in terms of things that haven't worked out?
Yeah, so there's a beautiful story of our partner in South Africa. They're called Living Lands, and they identified that essential oils would be a really great business case where botanicals could be grown within the landscape, and the oil could be extracted, and it would be a global market for essential oils, which was booming 5 to 10 years ago. It was really up and coming for infusers or for skin products and so on. So they set up this entire infrastructure, oil extractors, got all these farmers to grow lavender and other crops, and then were unable to sell quantities at the global market due to just very fierce competition. And the story around these are organic oils, these are regenerative oils. As much as that's a great story, they basically didn't sell enough product. So the entire supply chain went bankrupt. And so there was a lot of risks involved in taking that, and all of those stories of how that basically ethically failed have been documented by the growers, by Living Lands, and really publicly acknowledged. So there's some really honest articles online that we published around, that didn't work out. So I think also not only sharing success stories, but also sharing failure stories is something that takes courage, but it's really key. And we try to also really encourage that. So if you want, you can probably find the stories just by searching for that on our website, but I'm happy to share that direct link to the article as well. So who in the audience is in a position of either managing a farm or estate? There's a few here, so I'd love to hear from you, what drew you to this session in terms of applying that back at your farm or estate?
I think touching on the last point, it comes back to financial sustainability, because without financial sustainability we can't be sustainable for society or for the planet. But we need to look to probably broaden our income streams, and it's how we do that, and build a more solid platform that will allow us to go on and provide the benefits to planet and society that will be demanded of us. And where we go from there. But I think in a very local context, we lack clear guidance from our leaders, to put it mildly. But I'm here to start that journey and begin to look at the avenues that are available to us. And touching on what you said about more possibly local farmers groups, I think the opportunity exists to look globally at what is going on around the world and apply that knowledge and learning within the communities that we all sit in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're making some great points, and also I want to acknowledge that what you're saying in the beginning, if it economically doesn't work out, well then, it's just not working out. So there is also an element of the four returns sound really lovely, but we are also still operating in a predominantly capitalistic system. So if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. So there is also a risk of bankruptcy, and the essential oil example is an example of that too. So we are operating within that current system, and it's difficult to change. So the other thing you were saying about diversifying, we see a lot of farmers within our landscapes indeed diversifying. So whether it is additional income streams from tourism or from other types of value creation on the farm, building more resilient economic structures into the farm is a pattern that we see as well. as well as the last point you were making around international groups. So we see the local farmer groups being really key, but then the value of building these regional learning networks is also really, proven really valuable. So for example, earlier this year in the spring, we took a group of farmers from Southeast Ireland to the Netherlands to look at different local food distribution mechanisms and how the Netherlands had there were some innovations there around directly selling to consumers, where the risk wasn't on the farmer, but on a different kind of governance system where the financial burden is not actually on the farmer or on the consumer, but on a separate entity. So being able to identify commonalities between landscapes is really beautiful about my work, because we can then build particular learning networks around these themes. We call them thematic clusters or thematic groups, where farmers with particular challenges, and especially in the European context, there's still enough similarity, but also there's exchanges between, let's say, grain producers in Canada and Australia that have similar issues, and then we facilitate learning trips and learning journeys. So I think that's also key. So you're not feeling you're alone as a farmer in the challenge, but hey, there's many others actually involved that you can learn from and learn with.
Is diversifying. It has to be about the money. We have to have a vision for what the next 1,000-year, 100-year blocks, but what that's going to look like. And our biggest challenge at the moment is we don't know what our government want us to do. And it can change on a hairpin. Are we planting trees to rewild and be super friendly to nature, which we've been doing for 1,000 years anyway? Or do we need to worry about food security and feeding the planet? We're not talking about feeding. I personally don't think we should be talking about feeding, just feeding locally, because we're part of a global chain. And the food, we've seen it with Ukraine, the pressures with the war in Ukraine that have been felt by everybody in this room and everybody at home. We're part of a global chain. And so we need to know exactly where the money's coming from and where it's going, and we need to know what our government, what is their plan. And these two things, nobody knows.
The national government doesn't think long term, right? It's 4-year cycles, 5-year cycles. So it's really hard to work with national governments in the long term. We do see some longer term visions now coming in, but maybe 10 years, 7 to 10 years, you see national governments making food strategies or climate goals to 2050 and all that. So is it going to be government that's going to be directing us? I'm not sure. But what we see working well is landscapes coming together and defining their own visions. What does our landscape look like in 20 years? What does our landscape look like in 40 years? And that includes local people, local landowners, that can include estates, defining that for themselves and aspiring, creating a shared vision, creating a shared goal, aspiring with each other for that goal, and then bringing national government along. And often actually those long-term visions exceed national targets or national goals in ambition, but align very well. So they're not necessarily in conflict with one another. Because once you start to think long-term, you tend to become more resilient, more diverse, take nature into account. If you then start to think about rivers, okay, well, we do want this river to be healthy, we do want this forest to be healthy, etc. You tend to include more nature. So it aligns usually quite well. So we have, I think, a few more minutes. But the next session is starting in 10 minutes. A few more minutes for last reflections or insights and questions. Yeah, so Commonland uses a definition of a minimum of 50,000 hectares, but we're quite flexible with that. So, for example, the total landscape in southern Spain is about 1 million hectares. So that doesn't mean that everyone who lives in that landscape is involved, or that every farm within that landscape is a player. But it's the size of the landscape we look at. So it's often defined by ecological or landscape features. So riversheds, watersheds, maybe particular mountain ranges, or types of production. So it's the areas with rain-fed almond production in southern Spain. But thinking at the landscape level, the process of thinking at the landscape level is what's key. When we not look at either a particular commodity or a particular political boundary, such as a county or something, which is defined by a political distinction which is based on some historical division of land, which doesn't often represent all of the natural features in that landscape, then shifting to landscape thinking just changes the conversation. When we think about, okay, who lives along this river, and everyone who lives and farms along this river is either dependent on the river or has an impact on the river in terms of any runoff, etc. So then the river defines the conversation rather than any political boundary. And I think being able to have that dialogue at the landscape level is what's key for the process. It just changes the narrative. And we see it also in Ireland, when there is just something also about political boundaries which keeps people separate. So people from Waterford will say, well, no, I'm from Waterford. People from Cork will say, I'm from Cork. They support particular football teams. There is a kind of separation built into the narrative. And the moment you shift the conversation to anyone who's living by the Blackwater, it's like, well, then it no longer is relevant which football team you support or what county you live in. It's like, no, you live along the Blackwater or along the Blackwater estuary. So I think that's key, and it's more about the conversation than really defining the scale. However, we do make our landscape maps then quite specific in terms of those watersheds and mountain regions and what is and is not included. We do try to make impact at the landscape level over 20 years. So that may start with 5 farms, within a couple of years it might be 50 farms, then landscapes we've supported for 10 years, there's a couple hundred farms, and we hope that the majority of farms within a landscape are involved after 20 years. Not just farms, but land decision makers or land holders. All right, I think we can draw to a close here. 15 minutes, I think I'm on time. So unless there's any last questions or reflections.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.